Okay, well, I think we'll get started. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Robson. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Productivity Commission. I'm filling in today for Catherine de Fontenay for this session. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting and pay respects to elders past and present. We're very fortunate today to be joined by Alain Bertaud, who's formerly of the World Bank. He's an expert on urban economics and all the sorts of issues we're interested in Australia in relation to housing affordability and the structure of our cities and the productivity impacts and all of these topics. So without further ado, Alain, I might turn it over to you. Welcome. There is a Q&A feature for everybody in the chat. So if you have questions for Alain, what we will do is Alain will speak, and then I will moderate the questions. I've got a list of questions myself that I might refer to, but that is the way we'll run it. So Alain, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is always a pleasure to visit Australia, and especially visiting new cities for me. Melbourne is, I've never been to Melbourne before. So what I'm looking for in a city, what I think is the most important, is a labor market, how the labor market works within a city. When I insist on this labor market, of course, I do not mean at all that the only important thing in a city is just to go to work and back home, but that it's a labor market which produces resources that create the amenities that we like in a city. We like to go to a restaurant, to meet friends, to jog in a park, to go to concerts. All these things are possible only if the labor market works well. So the labor market is more a foundation for a superstructure, which are the amenities that we like in a city. There is sometimes a confusion among my fellow urban planners. By the way, I am an architect by training. I learn economics on the go. I am not a real economist in a certain way. I just learn it on the way. So many of my colleague urban planners have a bit a dream of a city composed of little autarkic neighborhood, and that will, of course, will be a very good layout for a city, because it will not require too much investment in transport or things like that. Everybody will live in a little village. This, of course, is a completely mythical image, but unfortunately, it has sometimes an influence in the way cities are designed and especially regulated. To me, a city is mostly composed of the decision of household and firms, where they make trade-off. Those household and firms are making trade-off between the location where they want to settle, the amount of land they would like to have, and the amount of floor space they would like to occupy. Now, of course, those trade-offs are very often restricted by the transport system and by land use regulation. In a way, the very existence of zoning, which define in a certain area how much land is necessary to build 1 square meter of floor space, is in fact making a trade-off. Substituting, the zoning is substituting itself to household and firms to make a trade-off on their consumption of floor space and land and the location. So this type of rigidity, I think, are responsible for at the high price of housing or floor space for firms, but also sometimes to an inefficient city shape. Because again, zoning is a top-down exercise. Zoning regulations, some of them are rather old, and even the most recent one are usually taken, the decision to fix a certain consumption of land implicit in the zoning are taken without taking into account the price of land, and the affordability of household. Household in a city are distributed on a long, mostly normal log distribution, and there is, the decision about the consumption of land and floor space are taken without any account taking into account the income of household and the price of land, which is of course changing all the time. So to me, one of the important things is to revise our zoning and land use regulation, to have an audit, to try to find why those numbers are fixed, and to try to remove some of those constraints, especially the rigidity of the land and housing market. On the other hand, of course, I recognize that in most cities, and especially in cities which are well managed with high income, households themselves are reluctant to see any change in their neighborhood, except the one who want to sell or buy. But the resident in a neighborhood are very reluctant to allow any change in the neighborhood, even small, let's say in the backyard, small housing in the backyard, or adding even sometime just 1 room or 2 rooms to an existing dwelling. This is a reality. It's a political reality in a way, because it's a decrease in the property right of a person, owning a lot, and it's an increase in the property right, in a way, a fuzzy property right of the neighbors on an adjacent plot. This is something, I must say, that I'm not able to solve. I think it's more a political problem, but it exists, and it has, of course, to be taken into account. There is another aspect also which is important, and in particular when we talk about Melbourne, it's that planners in advance have already decided a bit on the shape of the city. In Melbourne, I discovered recently that there is to constrain the extension of the city, there is this theory about wedge of green land, and development is allowed only along some corridors, and they are separate. Those corridors are separated by wedges. Now, if we get back to the idea of a labor market, normally when a city grows, a city larger than 1 million, a lot of jobs are going normally to decentralize from the city center. There are still a lot of jobs in the city center, but some are going to decentralize because of the high price of floor space in the city center, and they move to the suburbs. Now, if you consider that the labor market should allow any household to select the best job possible within a metropolitan area, it is clear that the system of transport should not just give access to the CBD of the city from suburbs to the CBD, but should also give access from suburbs to suburbs, because more and more jobs are normally decentralizing to other suburbs. Now, the shape that I see in Melbourne, in a way, this wedge system correspond to, in fact, the fingers, let's say, which expand in the in the agricultural area, or the empty area. And I don't see any transport system which will allow very much communication between suburbs to other suburbs. And I think that, for instance, if I look at New York metropolitan area, 70% of the commuting trips are from suburbs to suburbs. Only 30% are from suburbs to Manhattan, for instance. We have about the same proportion in Paris metropolitan area. So clearly, this growth of employment in the suburb, which is made not only necessary, but by the way, the technology allows it. Technology allowed to have a headquarters of a firm in the city center, but many of the clerical workers in much cheaper land in the suburbs. These things, in fact, this finger, growing of suburbs do not allow that. And I think that this is something which should be considered. Finally, just visiting again the suburb of Melbourne, I found that the issue was not so much maybe the fixed minimum lot size or the fixed minimum housing size, but there was also a lot of land, back alleys, access roads, open space, which were, very well designed, by the way. But I'll be curious, just looking at it, if you measure a square kilometer of suburban land along those, faraway suburbs, how much land do you need, including, only square kilometer, for instance? How much land do you need to build 1 square meter of floor space? At the end, for a city, what is important is the floor space. So I think that this is not known, because the regulation which contribute to the amount of land necessary to develop in order to create 1 square meter of floor space is usually coming from sometime tradition, sometime regulation, but regulation at the local level or at the state level. And this adds together to the cost of development. By the way, some of the cost of infrastructure is directly recovered through the price of housing. Others come from something somewhere else, but somebody has to pay for it anyway. And I think it would be very essential to know, when you develop 1 square kilometer of suburbs in the greenfield, how much is paid directly by the consumer of land and floor space, and how much come from a subsidy somewhere else, and all this is reflected. And all this trade-off, again, that household and firm should do between location, land consumption, and floor consumption, how much of those trade-offs are completely rigid and are not allowed. Finally, I think that for many years, cities were competing to attract jobs in the, big employers in the city, industries or services. We have seen some years ago, many cities in the US trying to attract Amazon in that name, and usually by providing tax subsidies, which I think is a terrible idea. And now I think I see a reverse, where cities are going to compete for people rather than for jobs. This is due in part to the new trend where the fertility rate of women, the total fertility rate, is going down very, very fast in most developed countries, and increasingly, by the way, also in developing countries. And more cities are going to have shortage of young labor, And again, here, the problem of affordability by household usually is hitting younger household rather than the older one. So the resulting very high cost of housing on the composition of the labor market will mean that you will have a labor force which is progressively aging and not very attractive for any firm to locate in a labor market where where the bottom is missing, and an aging population do not attract firms. And we have seen that most of the cities in Japan, which have a population of less than 5 millions, are losing population, while Tokyo and Osaka are increasing in population because all the young of those cities are going to the larger city. Because, again, the choice of employment, but also probably social life. So here, to summarize a bit this view, I think that the question of affordability is also, in the long run, a question of competitivity and productivity of the cities. And if this is not solved very quickly, some cities will, really realize that they are getting in very difficult economic situation, and extremely difficult to correct. When it's a demographic change are very difficult to correct. So let us audit those regulations and see what rigidity you can remove, either at the regulation of the subdivision itself, but also at the macro picture, the decision that planner had about how a city expand, whether it has the shape of a starfish or a donut or something like that. I think all these things are completely arbitrary. Now, I see, of course, a very important role for planners to play, but their role, I think, is more to the design of amenity, the separation of what is private and what is public. Certainly public good like parks and things like that are not really subject to market. They have to be, they have to be acquired or separated just top down. There is no other way to do it. And it should be opportunistic. Each city has a different topography, a different assets, natural assets. And then it is clearly the role of the government to separate those assets and do not allow the market to play in this asset. But for the area which are to be developed privately, I think that the priority will be to remove those extreme rigidity which do not allow any change when we are living in a world where technology and also geopolitical things are changing very fast, and we have to adapt very fast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alain. That was a fascinating summary. I do have a couple of questions, and I just remind everybody to put their questions in the chat. You mentioned that an audit of zoning and these planning regulations is a good idea. I guess, though, one question is an audit from what perspective? So, should urban planners, and I think you touched on this a bit, but what is the lens or window or the framework that they should be using in such an audit? Should it be an economic framework or social or environmental, or all of those things, that we have in traditional conventional cost benefit analysis? Or, and if they're not doing that, why isn't that the case? And maybe you could tell us a bit about what urban planners are the framework that they're using, if it's not the conventional cost benefit framework.
I think that they should look at the outcome.
Mm.
You know, the final outcome is that you need young professional, or when I say professional, I mean anybody working full time in the city, to be able to afford a house. This is an ultimate outcome. You know, if a school teacher cannot afford a house somewhere in the city, you know, there is something wrong in the system, and you should revise the entire thing. It is clear that, again, for the environment, there is a top-down decision which is specific to every city. You know, every city lives in a completely different natural environment. You know, if you are Dallas, Texas, in a featureless plain, it's very different from Sydney, for instance, or Melbourne also. So you have to adapt to that. For instance, it's clear that you have to reserve some public goods. It could be a hill, it could be a beach, it could be the river, you know, the sides of a river. And do you reserve along a river, 10 meters along the edge or 100 meters? That's up to you. That's up to, again, if this river is flooded or not. So I don't think this should be set by norms. It should be just an opportunity and a good sense. And also, you know, we are living in a democracy, so some people value certain things more than others. And so this is a top-down decision. There is no measurement. You know, I don't believe at all that a city should have 25 square meters of green space per person. I think this is absurd. You know, the quality of open space, for instance, depends very much on the topo. You know, if you are along a river, you have few square meters along a river are very, you know, very valuable, where you know, in another area they would be less valuable. So again, that's top down. When this top down, you know, the separation of these public goods, which include, by the way, major highways or roads, are removed, then I think we should let, in fact, household and firm decide what is their optimum consumption. I don't see, I'm not talking here about building code yet. I'm thinking the consumption that the consumer can see. You know, a firm or a household know that in a certain place, what they would like to consume in terms of floor space and in terms of land. Do they want to live in a lot where they have a backyard, or they are ready to live in a 4-story building or 5-story building? This trade-off should be made by the household themselves, for one good reason, is that different households in the same income group may require a completely different trade-off. And the average, you know, planners could measure an average trade-off that for average, a household in Melbourne is consuming 120 square meters of floor space. The average is not useful in the market. You know, you need to allow different households to make different trade-offs. And it's the same for firms. I have heard, for instance, that some planners think that industrial area should stay in the center or some should move. I think, don't tinker with those things. We planners know absolutely nothing about what a new industry require in terms of land, and we know absolutely nothing about the future employment, you know, or land intensive some industry will be and could be. So I think we should let them decide themselves. And it's a very big mistake to try to design a city the way an architect design an apartment. You know, when you design an apartment, you put the bathroom in a certain place, you put the kitchen in another place, and, you know, you use your experience and cost and, you know, and structure to do that. I think a city is not a big building, and it's constantly evolve. Again, this idea of industrial area, some probably 40, 50 years ago, industrial area had usually a lot of workers and a certain income. Let's say you could say certain, you know, somebody probably below the 30 or 40 percentile would be a blue collar worker, and then you will have factories with a lot of workers, so you will need to have transport going to those industrial areas. Now it's completely different. You could have an industrial area where there are practically no worker. And so the zoning have to adapt. The zoning, in fact, as we know it, should disappear, I think. There is no reason that somebody who knows nothing about either an industry, a firm, or the preference of household decide in advance, substitute themselves for those things, and decide in advance where they should be located, how much land they should consume, and how much floor space.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Mary Clark, and I think you did comment a bit on this in your earlier remarks, but it's around Melbourne, and I guess this is not a unique issue, that the homes that can be afforded by young people lie well outside of the city, but the jobs are obviously in the city. And maybe you can comment on that a bit more, and I'll just add my own reflection into this, is this idea of the 20-minute city. If you've heard of this idea.
Yes.
And maybe just maybe reflect on this idea of the 20-minute city in relation to the location of jobs versus houses.
If you have a city, a 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or 30-minute city, which become a target, you have to make a difference between 15 minutes or you say 20 minutes, right? 20 minutes to amenities and 20 minutes to jobs. 20 minutes to amenities, if it's walking, it means a certain density. A bakery shop can set itself only, if it has a catchment area where they will have enough clients to survive. So this is it's not a planner decision. It's linked to density and income. The higher the income, the more shops you will have, and the larger will be the shops. Look at a grocery store. If you look at just for breakfast, the different product for breakfast that you have in a grocery store. If you are in a rich city, just the breakfast cereals will take maybe 50 square meter, just to display the food. If you are in a poor neighborhood, then the breakfast cereal will take only 10 or 5 square meter. So again, the availability of a shop within a walking distance depends very much on the density and on the income of the household, for which the planners have no ideas, again. And if you have a more specialized shop, usually the specialized shop will have a larger catchment area, and that will mean that people will have to drive there. So again, the planners have no influence on that. Now, when it comes, so they can promote higher density if they want, but then if they promote higher density in order to have a grocery shop within walking distance, they are again making it a trade-off for households, deciding that being able to walk to a place where they get a good croissant is more important than how many bedrooms they have, which I don't think it's a good idea and especially because no planners can, only in Soviet Russia, planners will say, we have a grocery store for every 10,000 people, and they will locate the grocery store. And by the way, it will be a grocery store with very little product there too. That's the beauty of central planning. So this is, in a way, this 15-minute or 20-minute city is a distraction. When it comes to jobs, this is even worse, because if somebody moved to Melbourne, it's precisely because of the quality of the people who are here. That means the quality of the jobs which are offered in Melbourne. In the life of a person, the ability to change job is absolutely essential. When the word labor market, the important part of the labor market is market. That means that you can change job, you can, as you evolve, as you learn new things, you realize the things you like and the things you don't like. You realize your potential or let's say your weaknesses. And the great advantage of a large city is to offer an enormous variety of jobs for which you can choose where to go. Now, if the transport system is deficient, or if you have this terrible concept of the planner that you should find a job within 15 minutes walk from your apartment to your house, then you completely restrict this mobility and therefore your productivity. So the idea that a job can be located by a planner next to your house is completely fallacious, of course. It's absurd. If you move to a city like Melbourne, the transport system should be designed in such a way that anybody from any place in Melbourne should have potentially access to the maximum number of jobs. I don't think that it might be possible. Let's say, you can say within 40 minutes commuting maximum or something, or 1 hour commuting maximum one way. That's the way the transport system should be evaluated. Singapore, which it's a city which is very interesting, but I don't think we can copy Singapore. It's not very replicable. It's very unique. However, they do something very interesting, is that for the transport system, they constantly improve. Instead of saying we are going to try to spend 20 billion on transport, they say, now we did an investment, and from this neighborhood, we are going to increase the number of jobs available by using transit by 20%. And this is really the real criteria. So the idea that you can design a city with a job that you want next to you is complete fallacy, and it completely perturbates. We have to have a system where you can have access potentially to all the jobs in less than 1 hour. And not say, this is a blue-collar job, therefore is this type of people who live next to it or something. This is over now in this. So I don't believe very much in, I think this 15-minute or 30-minute city is a distraction. Because again, you will have, in Paris, center of Paris, you have something like, I think, 90 coffee shop within 15 minutes walk for any inhabitant of central Paris. But it comes because the density is 250 people per hectare and the income are very high. And if you are in the suburb, you will have a bakery, maybe, you will have to drive probably to a bakery. And it's due to the density. It's not due to, planning has nothing to do with that. The density is consumption.
Thank you. Do you think that, the way you've described it, that urban planning is perhaps sometimes trying to do too much? I mean, and that varies across jurisdictions, I guess, but, that the goals, as you've set them out, should be maybe more limited and recognize that, you can't affect all of these things because there's, decisions of firms and households and so on. And then related to that, where do you think the best examples of planning are around the world, and maybe the worst examples that you've seen?
So first, yes, I think that planners are trying to do too much, to control too much in private area and not do enough in public area. By the way, I correct that a bit for Australia. The 3 cities of Australia I visited so far, I find that the design of public space is pretty good. compared to many cities I have visited. Well, I'm talking about rich countries, like Canada, the US, or Europe. I think that I reproach usually planners to spend a lot of time deciding what is the right size for a bathroom or a bedroom instead of leaving it to the consumer. I think this is useless. But I think that very often they neglect the public space. For instance, when you have a subway entrance, whether there is enough space at rush hour for people taking the subway to move or something like that. And I think, by the way, in Australia, you do it pretty well. I'm very impressed by the way the streets are designed. Again, this is top down. The way you allocate space in a street between sidewalk, eventually a bicycle corridor, a tramway lane or a bus lane, and then private cars, it's arbitrary. There is no market signal for that. So you have just to monitor very carefully what influence it has on transit, on congestion, and you have to modify it. And I have the feeling that in Australia, you are doing that pretty well. I'm very impressed by that, compared to any other rich city. On the other hand, I am concerned about the way planners have decided, for instance, for the wedge thing, in Melbourne. I think this is completely arbitrary. I understand why, you consider that planners consider that the wedge is a good idea, to preserve nature in certain area. It's a form of constraining, if you constrain the supply of land, the wedge is a constraint on the supply of land, or land which is close to the business area. So you constrain it. At the same time, every land use regulation that you have in the book, minimum plot size, maximum floor ratio, maximum height, you have also the width of street, which is in advance, all these things force you to consume more land or more floor space than the market will allow. So you are boosting consumption of land and floor space, and you reduce supply at the same time. You don't need to be an economist to know that the outcome will be an affordable thing. If you boost, it's the same, by the way, when some program in the US, I don't know if you have that here, instead of doing public housing, subsidize the rent or even the purchase price for lower income group. Now, if it's for 4 or 5% of the population, this is fine. The state have to take care of, but say when it reached like it does in New York, people who are about close to them, or even sometimes slightly above the median income. So you have a supply constraint because of regulation, and you boost demand at the same time. The result is higher land prices. Again, you don't need, even to have followed an economic course to know that. So unless you remove the supply constraint, you cannot boost demand. Because if you do, you end up with higher prices. And so I will really consider the wedge, the objective of the wedge, if it's biodiversity, if it is access to recreation area, look at what it is and whether the wedge does that. Many cities have, for instance, a green belt. The wedge is not really a green belt. And in a way, it's slightly better than the green belt, I think. But it has still, it's a constraint on land supply at a closer to where the jobs are, toward to the center of gravity of the city.
You mentioned fertility and population size, and in Australia, as elsewhere, there's big debates around the size of our migration program. And then, there's also important issues around the composition in terms of, the kinds of workers and skills and so on. But another issue we have in Australia, and it's, this would be, it's not unique to us, but we are a very decentralized country in the sense that we have, very concentrated cities, but these large, many regional areas. And so there's always a question around, well, where are the migrants going to go? And, is there a way in which you can get them out into the regional areas, or is that just a bad idea to try to influence their choices because they're going to, they'll go where they go, where, as you've said, where the jobs are, or other amenities. Yeah. So maybe you can comment on, that particular issue. I guess it's the location of new arrivals in a country, and whether there's anything that policy can do about that, or in terms of our cities, or or it's just something it's very difficult to influence without creating big distortions.
Right. Yeah. The problem, with migration, again, if you have a supply problem of housing, is that, of course, it had more people, and there is a tendency for the country to say, we have a shortage of housing in Sydney and Melbourne. Why don't we send those people in area where there is no supply problem? But there is no supply problem because nobody wants to live there. So we're very low demand. Now, if a city has very low demand, if you have migrants, you want them to be integrated as fast as possible. They have a slightly different culture usually, and you want them to become citizens of Australia as soon as possible. When I say citizen, that they are aware of, being citizen means also being free to move. You don't decide where that's part of being citizen. So I would be very reluctant to, if you select by skill, this is a different thing that I think, that's probably legitimate to do it. Not, it's although we saw during COVID that indispensable people were not Nobel Prize in economics at the time of COVID. It was truck drivers. So be careful about selecting only very skilled people. Now, should they be directed to a city? I think not, because then they have less chance of being integrated. Imagine that you send just one national group in a small town, say 20,000, where certainly it's easier to develop new housing, it's cheap. Suddenly you will have a group of people speaking the same language, maybe even 30% of the population, and those people maybe will never mix. They will reproduce what they have known in their own country. So I think this selection is not very good. Now, in some case, for instance, sometimes you have area where there are no doctors left. So if you have an immigrant who is a doctor, you say, well, as a condition for immigrating, during 5 years, you will be a doctor in the outback somewhere. And so that's a contract, providing this is there is a fixed time on it. You say, well, it's like a little entrance fee that you have to pay. I think that would be limit, but it should not be based on an income, and a nationality, for instance. It should be on skill, and it should be temporary to alleviate, and normally it should be for skilled people, again, like a doctor or a nurse, maybe, or something like that. So I think that when you take decision for people with a grand design, usually you get it wrong. It's backfire at the long run, because people are people, and if you constrain their freedom too much, they are not Australian anymore. To be Australian is part of the nationality is to be free, and not to have the government tell you what to do and where to do it.
Very good point. So you mentioned some cities in Australia that you've been to. Where do you? What's the whether it's in Europe or the United States, or you mentioned Japan, some Asian countries. What are some what's probably the best example of urban planning that you've seen?
I, you know, I don't think any city is perfect because cities are evolving constantly. I like Hong Kong very much, but for personal reason. I like high density cities. I like Asian food. So you are by you like some cities in a way specialize in the sense that, for instance, if you like a large house and but you are not too concerned about amenities, a city in Texas would be wonderful. You'll have a cheap house relatively. You could have a swimming pool and afford it and things like that. On the other hand, if you like most European and I believe Australian, like the proximity of amenities, being able to go to many different restaurants, have a choice, going to a concert, to exhibition in an art gallery, then the choice is very different. You are going to make a trade-off. And with time also things change. In the Hong Kong I like might not be there anymore. What I liked in Hong Kong very much was, by the way, bookstore with books about China were censored in China. This has disappeared. So I don't think some cities are doing, for instance, from now on, I'm going to quote Australia for paying a good attention to the design of streets and allocating the street between, again, different things and being able to modify it when it does work. I think this is something Australia does very well, including, by the way, also in the suburb, there are sub-centers usually around the subway station or the train station. And I think that the space of those, center around us are well designed. And again, this is typically the role of planner because there is no market signal which tell you how to design that. It's just, your understanding of the way people work and you design it. So it's a talent really. But there is no, there is a long feedback that if it's well designed, people will like to stay in these cities. So overall, but it's only indirect. You cannot measure it really. So I think that Australian cities are doing very well for that. I am much less enthusiastic about the wedge thing. I will not quote for that because I think it's a very arbitrary, limit on land supply. For instance, Paris does very well by having absolutely no zoning at all between residential and commercial. However, they have a fantastic constraint, Paris municipality, on the size of building, the height of roof, the size of windows. But within the built area, you can completely, a lawyer can be on the fourth floor of a residential building, for instance. So I think that this creates the flexibility that is very good. But other things in Paris I do not like at all. For instance, the way they clean the street or things like that. So you see, one thing also, by the way, I like very much is if I compare to New York, maybe it's a low bar, but the cleanness of street and the way you have a way in the densest area, in the center of Sydney or Melbourne, to remove garbage very quickly and efficiently. I wish we had that in New York. So I think, Melbourne will be very high grade for certain things and not so good grade for others. So what is the optimum? Again, that will depend on your values.
It is interesting, I think, and from what you've said, one of the key sort of things about or roles of an urban planner might be to understand the culture of the city that they're in. That seems important.
Yes.
And
yes.
One of the issues and I'll just draw on a question here from Daniel, is what we call NIMBYism. So it's NIMBY, not in my backyard. And so opposition to development and the sort of tragedy of the anti-commons if you like, where you put so many barriers to development, but it's through the democratic process in many cases. So so it's a difficult problem to address. Do you have any comments around this kind of thing?
Yes, in a way, you could say that when you have a democracy, there is a size of population who should exert this right to democracy. For instance, some years ago, if it's very small, it's not a democracy anymore. Some years ago, in Stockholm, it was more a survey, but no, it was a relay vote. Every block could vote to see all the streets in the middle of the block should be developed. Practically every household who voted say we want to only the people in the block to have access to the street for cars. And so that means practically everybody in Stockholm wanted to privatize their own street, because the size of the consultation was one block. If you ask the people of Stockholm, do you want street to be privatized? Of course, nobody will say yes, it's a good idea. So you see the size. Now, when for NIMBY, in a way, it's an extension of proprietary, it's a fuzziness of proprietary right. You have a proprietary right within your boundary, but it's decreased by zoning. You assume that zoning is there for the public good, but then your neighbors also have a right to say, well, you want to add a floor, we don't like it. You want to open a shop, we don't like it. So in a way, you decrease your property right on your own property, but you increase the property right of the neighbors. If you increase that too much, at a certain time, you have a complete paralysis, because this property right that they have on your property is only to prevent things. They cannot say, we would like you to learn the violin or something like that. It's only negative. We don't want you to do things. And by the way, at the end of Tocqueville's book on the democracy in America, the last chapter, he talks about, does a democracy could become tyrannical? And he says, yes, a democracy will never force you to do something, but it could very well prevent you from doing anything. And I think that we have reached this stage, that in our democracy, by extending this fuzzy property right over neighbors, which prevent from doing anything. I think that, by the way, it's much worse in the US than it is in Australia. For instance, I have learned that in Melbourne, a lot of the skyscrapers who have been in the center of Melbourne have been built relatively recently. That means you can still do things. I have seen also in Sydney the new metro and the extension of public transport. You can still do things. But in New York, we can't. This is over. And I think that this is a major. So my conclusion on that is that at the end, in a democracy, you have the city you deserve.
Very well put. Well, I think we've got time for one more question, and it's probably too big to be left to the end by me. But anyway, I'll ask you anyway. We have seen different technologies in effect travel times between jobs. So working from home, we're conducting this seminar over Zoom, and then there's people who now worried about getting back to the labour market issue around the labour market effects of artificial intelligence. And do you have any big predictions about what that is going to do to cities around the world, things like AI and working from home?
Let's say working from home, what I notice in the US mostly is that large company, and especially high-tech company, who have employees who are more likely to work from home very easily, this big company, like Google, Autodesk, or our Amazon, are asking their employee to come back. And why? Because the productivity of large city is precisely when you have people who have different specialty who are coming together. And if you are isolated and you are very good in your field, you need some people who have different skill, and if you work together, you are more productive than if you are alone. So I think that here you have a tug of war between employees who feel it's really convenient to stay at home or at least commute 2 or 3 times a week, and company, including high-tech company, will say you have to come back. If for instance, I was in Google some time ago. I was invited several times, actually, because of the self-driving car. They wanted to know what will be the impact on the shape of cities. And I was absolutely astonished by the quality of the environment in Google Office to attract, so that the people will spend as much time as possible in the office. So that means cafeteria where you have food of different, Indian, Chinese, Korean, French. You had also daycare center for kids, so that women could work there without being worried. And at lunch, they will go in the playground with their babies and then go back to work. So this is not because they are very generous or philanthropic. It's because they want people to stay at the office and communicate with other workers who are very specialized, but specialty is productive only if you work with other people who have a different specialty from you. And so I see this tug of war. Probably it will be solved by working once or twice a week in the office, and how that will be organized. For planners, I think it will be a mistake to say, hey, I have this vision of this is going to happen. What we have to do is monitor. We'll monitor very carefully. And now, by the way, technology allows us to monitor very carefully what's that. We know every day how many people are through telephone or something, how many people are commuting, where they are commuting, when they are commuting. And so we monitor, and then we have to adapt all the services, especially transport and social facilities, to serve this spontaneous movement of people. And it should not be planned. The last thing to do is plan. It should be monitored, and then we serve. It should be demand driven. The transport system should be demand driven. It should not necessarily drive. Again, we should not have a preconceived idea of what the city is like.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation with you, and we hope to see you back in Australia one day. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.